In 1917, 5 oil paintings, all female nudes, were removed from a Paris art gallery on the orders of an outraged police chief. It was the only one-man exhibition the artist ever held, and he sold nothing at all. A little over 2 years later, he was dead at the age of 35. Then the legends began to grow, and they still do. He is, next to Van Gogh, everyone's favorite tragic artist. But what is the reality behind the voluptuous legend and the paintings that never sold? Who was Amedeo Modigliani? A few facts to hold on to. He was Jewish, Italian, born in Livorno in 1884. Given the name Amedeo, a name which he shares with Mozart, who, as it happens, died at the same age. Amedeo means beloved of God. More often, his biographers have played with his other name, Modigliani. Maudit in French means cursed, and seems truer of the man. He came to Paris in 1906, drifted from place to place, chased by creditors. Places like this, Cité Falguière in Montparnasse. Just a room come studio, exactly like one of these. Except that Modigliani's studio next door has gone, replaced by apartments for the rich, though perhaps not rich enough to afford one of Modigliani's paintings today. That's a familiar irony and a painful one. So what was the truth? Well, there are people on record who knew Modigliani and who were painted by him. Men like the writer, Blaise Cendrals.
Modigliani est un jeune Italien.
I met the young Italian, Modigliani, in 1907 at the Hotel de Perron in the Rue Loristo. He was divinely beautiful. He was light-hearted, robust, and thought only of enjoying himself and discovering Paris. He was dressed like every young Italian, in a hand-sewn gabardine, tapered at the waist, with the sleeves opening out to reveal white cuffs, which fluttered every time he gesticulated, which he did a lot.
For Cendrals, he was divinely beautiful, Adonis, a young Italian dandy parading himself before admiring eyes. Sadly, so many others who sat for Modigliani have left only their portraits. Like the art dealer Paul Guillaume, one of the first to buy Modigliani's work. Max Jacob, the poet. Kisling, a fellow painter in Montparnasse, Polish. Leopold Zborowski, another art dealer and almost alone as a champion of Modigliani. The sculptor Henri Laurence. The painter Soutine, who also had a studio in Cité Falguière. Fellow bohemian and hard-drinking companion of Modigliani. Picasso, a portrait of 1915, none too convincing. He too was in Montparnasse at this time, commented that Modigliani was invariably drunk in the cafes The Dôme and Rotonde. Dr. Paul Alexandre, 1909, a young dermatologist who, remarkably, bought more than a dozen paintings by the then totally unknown Modigliani, the kind of instinct which investors dream about. So, who remains? Who are the witnesses to that brief, shattered career so confused by legend? There are, surprisingly, many. One of them was Jeanne Sauvage, wife of the painter Leopold Sauvage, sat for Modigliani in Nice in 1918, a little more than a year before his death.
He was exquisitely polite and very lordly, magnificently handsome, and always light-hearted, intelligent. But he would leave me sometimes to go downstairs to drink a little, and I would lecture him, and he was charming.
Modigliani loved women, a great many, and women were often more charitable towards him than some of the men who knew him. The writer André Salmon.
He was a legendary figure, and that's what people love. I think they feel sorry for him. They probably say, poor boy. He had to face up to many challenges in his life. He was poor and nobody could save him. And he would waste any money that came his way. Towards the end of his life, he could have had a so-called normal life, but he ruined everything, defying his original poverty. His attitude is understandable.
It is a common cry that Modigliani was a waster of money whenever he had any, and a waster of his life. He spilt his life like wine. A friend and neighbor in the last years was Roger Wilde.
Modigliani was generally a caustic young man who always seemed drunk, even when he wasn't. Picasso used to say that Modigliani was only drunk in Montparnasse. I don't know if that's true, but he always had a soft spot for me. In any case, I never fell out with him, which is miraculous, because he was always looking for a fight. He was aggressive. He was very handsome. He looked like a sort of puppet, and even spoke like a puppet. He would recite poems. There was one poem he recited all the time.
So dark nocturne, a fairy nocturne.
So dark nocturne, very nocturne, until only palaces built on shafts of light appear in their enchantment. He had a sort of clownish accent, which was astonishing.
Léopold Lévy.
I often used to see him in Montparnasse. But I lived a fairly isolated existence. I didn't see a lot of him. I was a bit of a recluse at that time. Besides, I didn't take part in what was going on. That is not to say I criticized it, but I didn't feel like joining in.
Did he find Modigliani a bit of an exhibitionist?
I wouldn't dare say that about a man for whom I have such admiration. But perhaps it is true. Looking back, I say to myself, but sometimes I feel bad about saying so, that yes, he was rather an exhibitionist.
But perhaps it came down to that in the end. A picture of Modigliani the man begins to piece together. As both Roger Wilde and Léopold Lévy attested, there was an air of truculence and defiance about him. A troublemaker, even. But how did he strike those who encountered him casually for the first time, in a cafe or in the street? The actor Pierre Bertin.
Someone pointed out Modigliani to me. I can still see him, with his magnificent features. He was very handsome. He looked very Italian. He wasn't very tall, but he had a magnificent face, and he would walk along the boulevard with great pride. When I saw him, he looked like Don César de Bazan, straight out of Ruy Blas.
For an unknown, he managed to paint just about everyone who mattered. But then young poet of the day, Jean Cocteau.
I often heard people say he was mad. Perhaps because he used to give away his drawings rather than sell them. He would wander around the terrace of La Rotonde like a gypsy fortune teller and distribute his drawings. He gave them away.
In 1916, the sculptor Lipchitz asked Modigliani to do a portrait of him and his wife. Lipchitz's account of what took place was never filmed, but he described it in a letter written from the United States in 1954. It was to be a portrait which echoed their wedding photograph.
My price, replied Modigliani, is 10 francs a sitting plus a little alcohol. So he came the next day and made a whole lot of preliminary drawings, one right after the other, with tremendous speed and precision. The following day, at 1 o'clock, Modigliani came with an old canvas and his box of painting materials, and we began to pose. I see him so clearly, pausing only to take a gulp from the bottle nearby. From time to time, he would get up and glance critically over his work. At the end of the day, he said, "There, I guess it's finished." I felt some scruples at having the painting at the modest price of 10 francs, so I asked him if he could not continue, inventing excuses for additional sittings. "Well," he answered, "if you want me to spoil it, I can continue."
So Modigliani worked fast, very fast, trusting to the instant impression. One session was often enough. Another witness, Jeanne Sauvage.
Je l'ai rencontré à Nice.
I met him in Nice. At the time, I lived with my brother-in-law, Pierre Bertin, and my sister. One day, Modigliani came to see my brother-in-law, and I walked through the hall in a sky-blue dress. That evening, my brother-in-law said, "Modigliani wants to paint your portrait." I consented. The next day, he started work, and my portrait was done in 1 or 2 sittings. I don't remember exactly. It was the first. He worked very fast. He drew my face in a matter of seconds. First, he made me sit at the piano, and I played Ravel. He observed me closely, and he said, "Let's go." Then I sat in front of him, and the portrait was done so fast that I can't remember whether it was 1 or 2 sittings. He said, "I never rework a portrait."
One longs to ask why. Was it, as he said, out of fear of spoiling it, losing its freshness? This is what his daughter Jeanne had to say in her book about her father long after his death.
The question, why did Modigliani have to finish a painting in a single sitting? Why was he incapable of leaving it and returning to it afresh, is of fundamental importance. Perhaps, as well as being aware that he only had a few years to live, he suffered the anxieties of an artist tortured by contradictory aesthetic appeals and easily fell prey to despondency. His agonizing regret at not having pursued sculpture was largely responsible, more than his excesses or poverty, for undermining his self-confidence and, above all, his mental stability.
At night, getting him to go to bed was a terrible business. He would stamp his feet. He did a sort of bear dance. And he had a belt that went round his waist 50 times. And Kiesling tried to restrain him by holding his belt. Doing this bear dance, he unwound the belt until he was far away. And then he wound himself up in it again. He was delightful. Legends always transform us and deform us, but his legend is particularly deforming.
Deforming or not, the legend of Modigliani swims in alcohol. There's no doubt he drank a great deal. Accounts of his drinking habits, however, vary considerably. Listen to the Russian painter Creaciones.
Modigliani was a man who was always drunk. You couldn't talk to him. But when he wasn't drunk, he gave you good advice about painting. But he was always drunk. He didn't even need to drink a lot. From time to time, he would sleep at my place on the floor of my studio at La Ruche. In the morning, we got him out. He went back into the cafe, had a few sips of wine, and he was already off again. He was already in his normal state, because being drunk was his normal state.
He wasn't an alcoholic at all. He drank sometimes, but only very little, if he was very depressed. But in fact, all the things people said about him, that he was an alcoholic, and the film they made, which I didn't want to see, because I've heard it all.
Lumia Tchaikovsky met Modigliani in 1917 at the house of the art dealer Zborowski. She was Polish, and Modigliani painted her over and over again, 12 times in all. They're among the most delightful of his portraits. Many years later, she wrote her memoirs. To be painted by him, she said, was like having one's soul laid bare. Modigliani was entranced by her beauty and her Slav features. Exaggerating them, as always, he caught nonetheless the serene quality of her, the strength and yet the frailty of her looks. How curiously natural the distortions of her body look in a portrait as a whole. Only when the eye peers close at a single detail do we notice how absurdly distorted they are. There were many at the time who were outraged by these liberties, and many, of course, who attributed this vision of beauty to the effects of drink. And it was drink that so many witnesses talked about. Leopold Levy.
He was a terrible drinker. That's public knowledge. But again, when Modigliani drinks, perhaps he doesn't drink in the same way as other people.
He knew his fate was precarious, and I think he needed to take stimulants to find the energy to work.
There's nothing new or exceptional about an artist taking stimulants in order to work. And in a more drug-conscious age, we may be less surprised, less disturbed than Modigliani's contemporaries. More illuminating are the observations that the artist was aware he had only a short lease on life. Time wasn't on Modigliani's side, and he knew it. Hence, perhaps, the speed with which he worked, and hence the drugs to heighten his perception of things. But what were the drugs? Again, by today's standards, nothing so very horrific. We have the testimony of the painter Monzin.
He used to drug himself with hashish, and I think it soon began to affect him. I saw him taking it.
He was very handsome, slightly ravaged by what people, myself excluded, call his debauched lifestyle. He drank. There are drunkards who look good, but he was ravaged by drugs, and one of the worst, hashish, which is merciless.
This was how Modigliani saw himself only a few months before he died. The camera saw him quite differently. The proud and handsome Italian, the man who strutted, laughed, charmed people, drew them to him, and in particular, drew women to him. Because the focus of his life was not drugs or drink, even his own declining health, but women. The sculptor Ossip Zadkine.
There was no man for whom women were more important than Modigliani. We are still here to tell the tale. Modigliani was one of us, and there were women. Women loved Modigliani because he was kind. He laughed boisterously. He painted their portraits. I also know his daughter, who has written a book about her father. She's very much like him, in fact.
Jeanne Modigliani barely knew her father and grew up instead with a legend. And of course, as his fame increased, his posthumous fame, there were the paintings, once dashed off for 10 francs and now becoming sought after, valued, valuable. Portraits of people, many of whom she knew and talked to about her father. Who was he? What kind of man? What struck her, and it strikes us all looking at Modigliani's work, was how nothing of the anguish of the man is there. Nothing of the drunk, the drug addict, the rabble-rouser. Far from it. His world is inhabited by people, melancholic perhaps, but alert, vivacious, full of life. Serious, reflective people, looked at with a serious, perceptive eye. However rapidly painted, somehow the essence of each sitter is there, has been grabbed. Nothing is merely elegant, superficial, merely a likeness. Jeanne talked to a friend about what she found.
I was 15 months when my father died.
So, did writing this book about your father, Modigliani without the legend, require a great deal of research?
Yes, research among the survivors of that period, and a lot of work at the Videoteca Nationale, going through documents and books.
So you were like any other researcher?
Absolutely. Except perhaps that I have family papers relating to his Italian youth. But again, they are documents, not personal accounts. I was fascinated by the way legends grew up, and the connection between the legend of a painter like Van Gogh and his real life. For Modigliani, it was harder in a way, because for Van Gogh, there were letters. For Modigliani, there is almost nothing.
Did this legend exist in your family when you were a little girl? Was your father a legendary figure?
A little. It was a rather different legend, the kind that develops in a puritanical and very bourgeois family. Certain aspects of the character are glossed over, and others are emphasized. But I noticed that when it was a question of oral accounts, my family lied as much, if not more, than the art historians.
You just said lie, and indeed a legend is a lie, a holy lie sometimes. But what is the stuff of this legend? Perhaps that is where we should begin.
When I say lied, of course it wasn't intentional, but it is still lying. How did the legend grow? Which one? The family legend or the public? In my opinion, the public legend was created above all by the poets who moved in Montparnasse circles. Carco, for example, André Uta, and the painters also made a major contribution. I think that it was perhaps the end of a certain conception of the artist.
So you think that this legend was created in a way to make Modigliani the hero, the one who paid for them?
Precisely. He lent himself to that role for a number of reasons. Firstly, he died, which is a major reason. There could only be affection and no rivalry. Nothing, no envy.
In a way, he courted death.
Possibly, there is that side. The man who ruined his own life. He was quite handsome, in a rather ordinary way when you know the Italians, but he was striking. He was not as crude, as uneducated and coarse as someone like Soutine, for example. There I almost agree with the Parisian legend, as opposed to my family's legend. It's true that he drank, that he took drugs, that he had some spectacular fits of drunkenness. It is also true that he drank himself to death. There isn't a shadow of doubt.
Why to death?
There again, you have to take common sense into account. For example, it isn't true that he began to drink in Paris. He already used to drink quite heavily in Venice and had begun to take drugs. Besides, when he arrived in Paris, he had already been ill. He had tuberculosis. In those days, you couldn't get rid of tuberculosis so easily. There is also the fact, which I think is very important, that he was of a nervous constitution and very fragile. He came from a family with a history of madness, or at least of depression. On top of that, Paris, the disorientation, a bit of poverty, a lot of alcohol, and a lot of drugs obviously shattered that nervous balance, and he then carried on that way until it killed him. Perhaps he could have been cured. I don't know. We don't have his medical records.
No medical records, so little reliable information of any kind. Jeanne Modigliani found herself drawn further and further back in her researches. What sort of world had her father come from, that Jewish Italian family from Livorno? Respectable business people, she'd understood. Well-off bourgeoisie. Conventional. But there were surprises. For one thing, she found out that at the time of Modigliani's birth in 1884, they were actually penniless.
The family was completely bankrupt. Modigliani's father wasn't a very good businessman. He went bankrupt, and it was an utter disaster. When my grandmother was in labor, the bailiffs came. And as the law in Italy prevents the distraint of anything that is on the bed of a woman in labor, they piled all their precious knickknacks on her stomach. It was my grandmother herself who told me the story. And so Modigliani was born into poverty, and a rather spectacular poverty at that.
He had come from Livorno, from his village. He was rich. He had just received 260 to 280,000 lire.
Perhaps he made that up.
It's not certain, just because Modigliani was always making things up. Firstly, when he went to Paris, he was given some money, as always when a beloved child goes abroad. He spent it all at once, saying he was rich. And what is more, until the end of his days, from time to time he would boast that he was the son of a banker, the great-grandson of a banker, that the blood of great financiers ran through his veins. It was a sort of ostentation, as though he was saying he was a descendant of Spinoza.
Have you researched his stay in Venice?
First of all, he went to Florence, to the Academy for a very short time, and then he went to Venice. I found his records at the Academy, which showed he was there for nearly 3 years. He left Venice to go to Paris, without returning to Livorno. What struck me was that already in Venice he was leading a life of debauchery. I spoke to painters who were with him at the time. He wasn't at the Academy. He drank and frequented the sleazy parts of Venice rather than going to his lessons.
To sum up, the family papers you found show a doting mother, a father who was away a lot, a Jewish family but not practicing, a rather intellectual family.
Yes, they weren't practicing Jews, but culturally they were a typical Mediterranean Jewish family. Because they had scattered all over the place, Some of the family were in London, others in Tunis, and some more in Marseille. They spoke several languages, for a start, and had a broader vision of the world. As for his taste in literature, it was that of his day, and also that of his family. His grandmother translated D'Annunzio. Nietzsche was his young aunt's bedside book. As for Dante, in Paris they were astonished that he recited Dante, but all Italians do.
Modigliani came to Paris in 1906. He was 22. Not to Montparnasse. At that time, relatively few artists looked for studios south of the river. The place for artists was Montmartre. Picasso was here, Braque, many others. A Montmartre still rustic, a country village. Many years later, a man who knew Montmartre in those rustic days and who knew Modigliani revisited the place with a painter friend, a place rich in memories for him. Here was a street Utrillo knew well and painted often enough. And it was here that everything began for Modigliani in Paris. The visitor returning to old haunts was Blaise Cendrars.
We had a lot of laughs together, and I lost him when he squandered all his money, and he went to live like a pauper at the Bateau Lavoir in Montmartre.
The so-called Bateau Lavoir, or laundry barge, was a cheap commune for impoverished artists. It was all lofts and cellars and falling to bits. Picasso was there, recently arrived from Spain. So was Van Dongen, and many others. They stayed here till they could afford to get out. In Modigliani's case, the stay was brief. He got drunk one day and wrecked the paintings of his friends, or so the legend goes. The original Bateau Lavoir, long since burnt down. The place was virtually empty when Blaise Cendrars went back there in search of ghosts and memories. But one ghost who knew the place and knew Modigliani was still around, the Italian painter Gino Severini.
One morning, I was going up towards the Moulin de la Galette in the Rue Le Pic, and I met a gentleman like myself. He was about my height, similarly dressed. We looked at each other, then we walked past each other, and then we turned round. When we saw that we really were dressed in the same way, we turned round again and said, "You must be Italian." He said, "Yes, I'm from Livorno." And I said, "I'm from Corton-Padares." And that was how we got talking. "What do you do?" "I'm a painter." "So am I." And that was the beginning of our friendship, because we saw that we had a lot in common. Besides, when you're young, you don't have a clear goal. Why were we in Paris? Because we'd heard that the art movement in Paris was the most contemporary and the most dynamic.
In Paris, Modigliani's paintings emerged cautiously out of darkness. The earliest works belong to the night, sombre, unhealthy looking even. Strongest influence, Toulouse-Lautrec, but without the panache. They were paintings, like so many others at the time, by an artist feeling the first surge of Paris in his veins.
His painting was like that of Van Dongen when Van Dongen arrived in Paris. It was what I would call today proletarian painting, with social leanings. The complete opposite of what he painted later, and which made him famous.
Paris was a forcing house. The search for one's own identity as an artist, as with all new arrivals, was through a jungle of so many talents, so varied, so many influences to absorb.
Don't forget the famous Cézanne exhibition, which was a great shock for Modigliani. Afterwards, with Cézanne's influence, there was a sort of balance, or rather a quest for a balance, between the Cézanne-style vision of volume and psychological research.
In those same years, 1906, 1908, Modigliani met one of his very few patrons, the first of them, the young Paris physician, Dr. Paul Alexandre. He painted the doctor's portrait several times, and now the typical elongations are beginning to creep in. It was with Dr. Alexandre that Modigliani made another discovery, African sculpture at the Musée du Trocadero. And it was with Alexandre that he went to exhibitions of Matisse and Cézanne. More important still, the doctor introduced him to the sculptor Brancusi. For Modigliani, who'd always wanted to be a sculptor, this was the most valuable contact of all.
Unfortunately, I didn't meet Brancusi. When I made up my mind to write to him, he was dying. Modigliani was probably already sculpting, but the encouragement of a man like Brancusi must have made a huge impact.
Particularly for an artist like Modigliani, who, when he arrived in Paris, introduced himself not as a painter, but as a sculptor.
It doesn't surprise me enormously, because I know he had already tried his hand at sculpture in Italy, and that it was his great ambition to be a sculptor.
Only some 25 carvings by Modigliani survive. It's not known how many more he did, but we do know of carvings he hoped to do, because he made these drawings. Caryatids. Pillars of tenderness, he called them. And they hint at a richness that was never realized, an intensity of feeling, such inventiveness, fluid forms. But he abandoned sculpture. We don't know why. Cost? Ill health? The demands of sustained effort. Whatever, the loss is ours. Earlier, in 1909, he'd also abandoned Montmartre. He was then 25. 10 more years of his life remained. And apart from 2 visits to his native Livorno and 1 journey to Nice, Modigliani spent those last 10 years here in Montparnasse. One studio after another, none even basically comfortable, half a step ahead of creditors. For 3 years, from 1910 to 1913, he lived here, long since demolished, number 14, Cité Falguière. And here he returned to painting, though he continued to carve in stone from time to time. Indeed, one reason for moving to Montparnasse may have been the proximity of Brancusi, Brancusi's studio. And yet in some ways, in crucial ways, Brancusi was the antithesis of Modigliani. He was infinitely patient, preferring to work and rework a single idea, polishing it into a minimal statement, like well-chosen notes of music echoing on and on. Temperamentally, Modigliani was quite different, a man driven by impulse. And a paintbrush was perhaps more suited to that temperament than a chisel. Modigliani was a man who needed to grasp impressions on the wing, and passions on the wing. Above all, passions for women. There's nothing in all the corpus of art quite like the nudes of Modigliani, and they are, surely, the core and essence of what he was as an artist, bringing together an intense sensuality with what Lumia Tchaikovsky said about being painted by him, that it was like having one's soul laid bare. These two qualities seem precisely to balance one another. Desire for a woman, gazing at her with lust, possession. At the same time, inhabiting her spirit, sharing her experience as if she might have painted it herself, guiding his brush. As a result, they are moments frank, yet extraordinarily private, as though we oughtn't to be here. One's reminded that his predecessors, Titian, Rubens, Goya, even Renoir, painted nudes with a certain public in mind, and therefore with some objectivity, self-consciousness. Modigliani had no public. His paintings were, in their conception, for himself. They mirror the passion, the engagement of the whole man for this woman before him. A desire which caresses everything about her as though painting itself were a feast of love. And the woman lying here were not an object of love, but a participant, a celebrant. Photographs of Modigliani show little beyond the morose, arrogant young man, or not so young now, boozing with cronies in the cafes of Montparnasse. His love life was public talk, mainly because he lived it so publicly. Then in 1917, he met a young art student by the name of Jeanne Hébuterne. She was a friend of the sculptor Shana Orloff.
Jeanne Hébuterne was an extraordinary woman. She was rather mysterious and difficult to get to know. But she was like a little Gothic statue, with long plaits. And her extraordinary green eyes. There was always something inexplicable about her, something mysterious. Many people were drawn to her. I was the one who took her to Montparnasse and introduced her first to Fujita and then to Modigliani.
Do you regret that?
It was a mistake. Because her family reproached me for doing so. In France, it is very difficult for a foreigner to enter a French home. I was perhaps one of the only foreigners who was invited to meet Jeanne Hébutern's family. And then after that, when the tragedy of her suicide happened, they held it against me.
But I believe she was the great love of Modigliani's life.
Yes, I think she was. But he reproached her for not being a better mother. She wasn't particularly interested in her first child. She was too young. She was only 17 or 18 when she had the child.
Jeanne Modigliani was that child.
I don't feel the regret that Shana Orloff does. Her life was perfectly coherent, brief, but absolutely coherent.
The ethereal beauty of Jeanne Hébuterne, that dreamy, absent air, is hard to recognize in the portraits Modigliani did of her. As if the qualities she possessed were too elusive, too fragile to be caught on canvas. Or else she appealed to him in ways he couldn't paint. Now the elongations of the figure begin to look like mannerisms, presenting a mask of her, not her essence. A mask with unseeing eyes. In 1919, Jeanne became pregnant again. Then one evening in January 1920, Modigliani could no longer go on. He had a high fever and began hallucinating. When a friend called at the studio in the Rue de la Grande Chaumière, he found the place freezing, Modigliani in bed, unconscious, and Jeanne huddled beside him. The friend called a doctor. The sick man was rushed to hospital, the hospital of charity. But Modigliani never recovered consciousness and died on January the 24th. Early on the 26th, Jeanne threw herself from a fifth-floor window. Her family refused to accept the body, and a workman took it away in a wheelbarrow. It was several years before she was allowed to be buried with him, here in the Père Lachaise cemetery in Paris. She was 21. For both Jeanne and Modigliani, the word tragedy ceases to be a cliché. They spilt their lives.